Tēnā koutou katoa, ko Alice Pako Ingoa, hei pukenga matua ahau ki te whare wananga o Tamaki Nakaro. Hello everybody, my name is Alice Mills. I'm a Senior Lecturer in Criminology at the University of Auckland.
Good koutou everyone, I'm Cinnamon and I've been working with Alice on this project since last year, helping with interviewers doing RA work.
Kia ora. So today we're going to talk to you about a mixed method study that we've been carrying out, funded by the Royal Society of New Zealand Marsden Fund. We've called it Going Straight Home, and basically it aims to explore the role of stable housing in reducing reoffending amongst former prisoners in Aotearoa, New Zealand. Today we're going to talk just about one particular aspect of the study, the kind of quantitative part, and as I say, it's mixed methods, so we have a quantitative and a qualitative part. So we're going to be looking at the results of our structured interviews with people in prison prior to release from prison, and then the follow-up interviews that we've done with them 6 months later. There is also a second follow-up interview 12 months later, but we're in the process of doing those as we speak. And in particular, we're going to look really at their kind of pre-release expectations of housing and kind of comparing that with the realities of finding and keeping housing post-release. So just a little bit of context then, and I apologise to those of you that were here last time because these are quite similar to last time, but I thought it's still useful to remind you of the context of the study. We know that recidivism is still a kind of substantial problem in New Zealand. We know that within about 2 years, around about 60% of people leaving prison are reconvicted, and over 40% are re-imprisoned within that time. We also know these figures are higher for certain social groups rather than others. In particular, it's fairly well known that Māori tend to have a higher rates of recidivism rather than non-Māori. And evidence from overseas has suggested that stable housing can reduce the risk of reoffending after release from prison, and conversely, post-release homelessness is likely to increase the risk of reoffending. So even a post-release study done by New Zealand Corrections by Morrison and Bowman found that more than any other factor, a lack of stable housing was the most critical contributor to negative post-release outcomes. In terms of the international literature, estimates of the reduced risk associated with stable accommodation varies quite substantially. From what we've found, it can vary between about 11% and 62%. So there is a fairly wide gap in there, I think it's fair to say. But most of the existing studies have got various kind of methodological limitations. So, for example, particularly the American literature tends to rely only on parolee samples. So people that tend to be in on a longer sentence and are released on parole, largely because they're a lot easier to kind of keep track of. Often they only examine re-imprisonment rather than reconviction, and they sometimes just evaluate specialist housing projects rather than looking at kind of more general prison sample. But in addition to that, we don't know much about the kind of how and why. What is the connection between stable housing and potentially reduced recidivism? Is it because housing is simply associated as well with employment, stable employment? Is it also related to family factors as well? If they have strong family support, they're also less likely to reoffend. So we need to be aware of these kind of confounding factors and potential selection effects as well. Is it possible that housing is just kind of an indicator of broader stability post-release? We also need to bear in mind, of course, I'm sorry that it's covered up here, that housing may not be merely a roof over someone's head, but also a home, or as Dupuy and Thorne suggest, a kind of secure base around which various identities can be constructed. In terms of post-prison housing in New Zealand, well, we know that last year, around about, under 8,000 people were released from New Zealand prisons. And corrections themselves have estimated that only about half of releasees are able to settle into long-term accommodation. In a 2013 internal corrections memorandum, it was estimated that between 600 and 700 people are released annually with an unmet housing need. And of course, that number is likely to change with the prison population as well. And corrections and other government departments fund a variety of different housing schemes to provide housing for people coming out of prison. Possibly the most well known of this is the Supported Housing for Long Service scheme that's funded by corrections, usually run by various different community organisations, NGOs such as PARS, Salvation Army, Anglican Action, and that provides 13 weeks accommodation followed by 13 weeks individual case management support for high-risk offenders that are serving over 2 years. And we know that this is still a current interest of corrections, shall we say. So in the budget in 2018, Corrections and Housing New Zealand were awarded nearly $58 million over 4 years to enhance various and expand various housing and support options. New initiatives have included things like the AHINI programme, which is a residential reintegrative therapeutic community based in Hawke's Bay, run basically with Ngāti Kahungunu, and it provides support for wahine on home detention or parole, offering a reintegrative pathway based on kaupapa Māori principles. And the 12 women can stay, that are in the programme at any one time can stay there for up to 3 to 6 months. And that's been billed by as the first by Māori for Māori initiative in this space. In terms of our study then, we've got two kind of key aims, and we kind of decided to do this study because despite the kind of substantial amount of international literature on the relationship between post-prison housing and recidivism, these studies tend to rely on quite westernised conceptions of family, home, homelessness, society, and also potentially reintegration. So we really wanted to find out whether or not there was a relationship here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, where the cultural context of reintegration is likely to differ quite substantially from those other jurisdictions. So firstly, we aim to kind of examine whether stable housing is associated with recidivism in New Zealand in a potentially causative relationship. So we're following a cohort of participants through the period of, so we interview them before they're released from prison, and then we follow them post-release as well, so through that kind of release process and beyond, to establish whether there is any relationship between stable housing and reduced risk of recidivism. And unlike previous research in this area, we're also seeking to account for other factors, things such as employment, whānau support, mental health, addictions, etc. But we also want to look at the how and why of this relationship. So how might housing actually have an impact on reduced reoffending? And this will be in the second part of the study, which aims to evaluate the role of stable housing in terms of desistance from crime. And this will include us looking at the political, social and cultural context in which housing is provided, which of course will include the effects of colonisation, intergenerational trauma, and potentially also mass imprisonment as well, and the relationship between stable housing and social capital. We also really want to unpack the meaning of stable housing. It's banded around in the literature so often, but very, very rarely actually defined. And we want to consider whether or not this intersects in particular with ideas of home and how that may affect identity as well. So in terms of our research, we started stage 1 of our study, which is, as I say, the quantitative. We began that last year back in Auckland Women's Prison. We've managed to complete 203 pre-release interviews in 6 different prisons, and we spoke to people up to 4 weeks prior to release. And then we've followed that up with 6 months interviews towards the end of last year and the beginning of this year, and we're now on the 12-month follow-up interviews, so we're a year on. And we're a little bit delayed at the moment, partly because of the effects of COVID. And we're now also starting to conduct some of the narrative interviews for stage 2. In terms of our research sample, as I say, we spoke to people in 6 different prisons and they were due to be released in the next 4 weeks. The time that they had prior to release actually differed quite substantially between the interviewees. In one case, we actually interviewed somebody about an hour before they were due to be released. We managed to just get in there quite quickly. And we made several visits to each prison to recruit participants. We kind of did it in sort of monthly sweeps after a while. And we interviewed them either on the housing units or occasionally also in visits, if that was depending on what the prison kind of wanted us to do. And we'd just like to thank corrections staff, particularly Paula, who's sitting here, at the head office, and those working in the prisons for facilitating those visits. In terms of our sample, as you can see, 74% of our sample were Māori, so that's quite an overrepresentation in comparison to their proportion in the prison population. But we do have a kind of underrepresentation of Pacifica and other, particularly Asian. So 12% of the prison population are Pacifica and 5% are Asian. So we do have a low proportion of those in our research sample. We've included also a greater proportion of women in the study than are actually in the prison population. And we really wanted to do this. We've kind of oversampled women quite deliberately because we're quite anxious to learn about the differential experiences of women, and also to ensure that we had enough women in the post-release sample, given that these kind of longitudinal studies tend to have fairly substantial attrition rates as well. We asked everybody that we spoke to in the pre-release interview if they knew where they were going to be living on release. And as you can see there, we actually had more women rather than men suggesting that they knew where they were going to live post-release. This is actually somewhat surprising and kind of out of sync, I guess, with the international literature that has actually suggested that women, particularly Indigenous women and women of colour, are actually tend to have greater difficulties finding housing and release. And this may say something about that cultural context of New Zealand, and particularly maybe reflective of stronger whānau support in particular. We also found that Māori were slightly more likely than non-Māori to have somewhere to live on release. This again was somewhat surprising, given that we know, unfortunately, that there is discrimination against Māori in the rental market, and you will have heard some of that a few weeks ago on Radio New Zealand, and also that they're less likely to own their own homes. So again, we're not quite sure. We'll seek to try and unpack this in the narrative interviews, but it may be about them having kind of wider support systems potentially. It should be noted, though, that just because people knew that where they were going to live, or they said that they knew where they were going to live on release, this doesn't necessarily mean to say that they had long-term stable accommodation planned. So at the end of the interview, we asked people for their contact details so that we can follow them up on release. And only just over 50% of us were actually able to give us an address of their own at that time. So we then kind of probed a bit further and asked people where they expected to live post-release. As you can see, the majority planned to live with family and friends. In some cases, this was only likely to be kind of quite temporary, and they admitted that it was just a stop for now. It was often a place that probation had approved for them, but they didn't want to settle there. It was just the only choice they had at this particular stage. The proportion wanting to move, who were planning to move to private rented accommodation, was somewhat surprising to us. We were expecting that to actually be a little bit lower, but we discovered that in many cases it was because they'd lived in that accommodation prior to coming into prison. The partner and often their children as well were still in that accommodation. They were simply just able to return back to it as well. And you'll see as well that there's a small percentage of people who owned their own homes in addition to that. In terms of the low number that were able to give an address, though, I think this may be because in some cases they were expecting to go to NGO accommodation, so that run by those things like supported accommodation run by community organisations, or they may be going to live with friends, but they wouldn't necessarily kind of know the address of that accommodation. And this kind of gives some idea of kind of how tentative that kind of arrangement was, and how it wasn't seen to be a long-term option necessarily. So it was often a kind of post-release option on immediate release, but it seemed to be quite transitional. They didn't view this as a stable home necessarily. And this kind of makes it important to kind of dissect what we mean by homelessness. In particular, we tend to consider homelessness as rooflessness, but we have to consider that sometimes these people that have got somewhere to live, such as staying with family and friends, still may not be stable housing, even though they've got a roof over their head. We also asked asked everybody whether they'd had any support in terms of finding housing and release. We found again that women were less likely to have had support. This may be because they felt that they're less likely to need it, but it may also reflect the smaller number of housing initiatives for women at the time when we were carrying out the interviews, and we know that there are some initiatives for women in train. Men more likely to have received help, and again this may be because more agencies cater for them. In Christchurch Men's, for example, which was one of the prisons we did research in, as well as the statutory agencies, there's a number of fairly well-established NGOs such as the Salisbury Street Foundation and Pathway that were providing services to the men in Christchurch Men's. We did ask this question, as I say, of everybody, even if they had a housing on release, and we're aware that corrections does do a substantial amount of work to try and ensure that people do have somewhere safe and suitable to live. And as I say, many of them kind of indicated that even if they had housing, it wasn't necessarily where they wanted to go. They wanted help to go elsewhere. And in some cases, because they didn't want to go back to a certain part of the country, or they didn't necessarily want to go and live back with another family member. Now, although the interviews were predominantly structural interviews, tick boxes, etc., we did leave a nice open space at the end for any extra comments. And it was at this point that participants really shared some of their worries and concerns about their housing post-release. In particular, they were really worried about whether or not they were going to be able to go to a positive environment. And this came up particularly in discussions of supported accommodation or shared accommodation, which are so things such as hostels in particular that are likely to have a kind of mix of different people and influences by their very nature. So it may be quite difficult to ensure that the residents creates a positive environment, shall we say. We also had sometimes quite mixed feelings, as I say, about living with family. Some wanted to be very close to their family, their whānau. Felt it was a very important source of post-release housing and support. Others were less keen and felt it was a really very much a last resort or the only place that probation would approve for them. In some cases, they already expected tensions within the household or arguments with other members of the household, or they didn't want to be a burden, or alternatively, they just wanted a place where they could establish their own independence. They wanted some control over their environment. And also in a couple of cases, they also said that they were concerned that their kind of living situation would actually lead them to reoffend as well. Linked to this is also the fact that many of our participants, even if they weren't living with their children, wanted housing that was suitable for children, housing that was suitable for children to visit. So for many, this ruled out any kind of shared accommodation, such as hostels, which were perceived to be unsafe for children, but also things like motel rooms, because there was no rooms for the places for the children to stay. They also didn't really know how to apply for housing. They didn't know the kind of system in terms of going through WINS, for example, that really wanted help in terms of what the process is and to be guided through it. And some people also mentioned the fact that they were very aware that they couldn't apply for private rentals, because generally you do that online, or often you start to do that online. And of course they didn't have internet access. But the majority of comments also kind of related to the timing of support, particularly in relation to out-of-gate services. So out-of-gate are navigational services for people who are serving under 2 years, or so short-termers, or those that are on remand. And some people had had great experiences with out-of-gate, but others felt as if they wanted help with housing from out-of-gate a lot earlier than they actually received it. So even though we're sometimes speaking to them, say 2 weeks before they were due to be released, many pointed out that out-of-gate didn't help them find accommodation when they've been in previous times until they were released. So sometimes they'd been told, for example, oh, out-of-gate will meet you at the gate. So they knew they were going to be meeting somebody at the gate, but they didn't know much more about it. They didn't know what to expect. And that really led to quite substantial anxiety. So one of them actually said to us, it should be organised so that we know where we're going. And they also felt that they needed to kind of help in terms of negotiating WINS and potentially, and also obtaining correct ID, which is a substantial problem. But all this needed to happen a long time before release, rather than happening on release itself. Over to you.
Kia ora. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the 6-month interviews. So we managed to get 80 people from the original sample in our 6-month interviews, which is about 39.4% of the original sample, which sounds like a low number, but it's pretty standard in this, in similar research doing these kinds of follow-ups. Some of the highest numbers are like 70 to 80%, but they're quite like high budget research, where I think they even give their participants phones and that kind of thing. We tried our low budget methods. We had postcards, texts, phone calls, emails. And so, yeah, we're pretty happy with that. There's a slight decrease in the representation of Māori in the 6-month sample, and a slight increase in Pākehā. And one of the prison that we got the highest proportion of people to do the 6-month interviews was at Christchurch Men's. So that might also be reflective of this as well. So here we've got, the yellow is the entire sample, so where people expected they were going to live pre-release, and the green is just of the people, 80 people who we were able to interview. We interviewed 66 people in the community and 14 people who had returned to prison. We went in there and did the interviews. And so for the people in prison, what the numbers are reflecting there is where they were living just before they entered the prison system again. So as you can see, the kind of expected place where they were living matches quite similarly to where they did end up living. So people do kind of, we think, have a fair idea of who we're able to talk to, a fair idea of where they will be going. For those in their own housing, while it may look like a kind of ideal, living situation in their own home, when you look at the stories behind the numbers, it kind of complicates that picture. So for example, we had a few people who were living in their own homes. Some of them didn't have running water, some of them didn't have electricity. One of our participants had to walk down to, like a river behind their house and fill up a bucket to use that for bathing and that kind of stuff. So although on the surface, something like home ownership does seem like an ideal category, that can be much more complicated for our participants. Yeah, it's also a really high number with friends, family and whānau, and that number, with that as well, friends and whānau, people would describe often not wanting to live with them for a whole host of reasons, but having to do that because it was their last resort. And kind of reasons are, you know, like sometimes breakdown in relationships, sometimes it was tied to they just didn't want to feel like a burden to their family or whānau. Sometimes it wasn't ideal housing. And so what this reflects is kind of friends and whānau being a last resort, but I think it's also really important to acknowledge that really kind of like powerful resourcing that whānau does to support people once they come out of prison. And sometimes in lieu, you know, doing that support in lieu and sometimes of other services. And so it's really great to see that people have been able to draw on those connections. For many with living with friends and family as well, they did often describe that as being very temporary and transitional. Like, I'm just going to be there for a few days, you know, and then I'll figure it out. Or I'm just going to be there till I save up enough money for a bond or rent. So even in that in and of itself is quite an unstable or temporary kind of living arrangement. And so here we have, so this table compares just with the people who we interviewed in the community, where they expected they were going to live versus where they actually did end up living at the 6 months. So 5 people who expected to return to their own homes, only 2 actually did, and 3 ended up living with family or friends. Many of those who expected to be living in an NGO or supported accommodation are no longer there, but we would expect this, as most supported accommodation usually has you know, shorter time limits than 6 months. Unfortunately, some people expecting to go into NGOs or supported accommodation were not able to secure more stable long-term accommodation after being there, one being in a hostel and one being in a motel. And interestingly here as well, the number of people living with friends, family and whānau has reduced by nearly a third, kind of reflecting how that is quite a temporary option for those who use it. And living on the streets versus, and missing, that kind of category is inclusive of people who are homeless on the streets, not sure where they were living, or also just moving between a lot of different you know, types of accommodation, couch surfing, that kind of stuff. We should have like a note of caution with this, with these figures, is that, you know, it's by the very nature of us being able to contact these people, we do kind of have, you know, in the 6 months interviews, people who are most likely to be in the most kind of like positive or beneficial housing for them. And so we're missing all those middle people who, you know, we're not really sure what's going on. We assume that it is because it is highly unstable. But then we do also, again, capture the other side of that by being able to talk to all the people at 6 months who have been back into prison and kind of can hear those experiences of, you know, what led up to that. So this is looking at the number of moves, how many times they changed address within the 6 months after their release. And so while 43% of our participants didn't move at all, the same proportion, 43%, moved twice or more. And that's currently how unstable housing is defined in the literature, so 2 or more moves. So we'll be really interested to compare recidivism rates of the people who have moved more than twice compared to those who hadn't moved at all. And so this also really reflects as well the highly transitional kind of way that people, you know, that life does turn out for people who have left prison. We'll follow up about this more in the kind of 1 year and stage 2 interviews. And it's also, I remember one participant I was talking to, they said that prison was the longest place they'd ever stayed in their life since they were 16. And they were in their like 30s or 40s when I was talking to them. So kind of, you know, it's like really highlighting how complicated and complex life can be and how we kind of approach housing in a way that, you know, if that, you know, for that person, and I think it's reflective of a few people in our sample, if prison is the most stable accommodation they've ever had, how then can, you know, how does that work for moving forward and trying to find your own stable accommodation outside of those kinds of contexts and areas? So with these comments, so the comments at the end of the kind of 6 months as well, we talked to people about what their concerns were, their challenges, that kind of stuff. And so despite their expectations, many participants had faced difficult challenges within their existing housing or in trying to find kind of long-term, more stable housing. In some cases, they felt that their housing situation might lead them to reoffend, and many described their situation as feeling like they were set up to fail. And I think that's a sentiment that a lot of our participants have kind of expressed. There were concerns raised about housing provided to them as part of supported accommodation. Alice talked about quite a lot of that, but there was also the lack of privacy. A lot of participants talked about, like how it's highly surveillance, there's lots of cameras, there's lots of control around who's allowed to visit and curfews and that kind of stuff. And another kind of common comment that people would make is, I've served my time, I've been in prison, but being here also feels just like a different version of that. Some people did feel unsafe, there was a lot of thievery and that kind of stuff. And that's often complicated with things like mental health and addiction issues. So people would express a lot of concerns about that kind of thing. They also would raise concerns about a lot of like police presence sometimes and visits from gang members. There's also in some kind of supported accommodation, different kind of, like criteria, obligations that you have to meet in order to stay there. And so like for some supported accommodations, one of the criteria is you have to be constantly looking for your own housing. I remember one participant talking about how after paying rent, they only had $90 left for the rest of the week, for like food and transport and that kind of stuff. Their supported accommodation was in South Auckland, and in order to stay in that accommodation, they had to go and look at a house viewing in North Harbour, which is like Albany. And, doing that with a low amount of resources, no car, public transport across such a vast part of Auckland. I mean, that can be really difficult, but they do these things, to try and find housing, and two, to try and keep, the kind of supported housing that they already have. It's not all negative in supported accommodation. A lot of people did describe a lot of really kind of like positive support, positive experiences. Even within that too, they did feel that NGOs themselves were quite underfunded and under-resourced. They could recognise that, but didn't kind of, like blame the NGOs, and they did feel a kind of like a sense of security and support a lot of times as well. So not all bleak in the supported accommodation area. Other issues raised were relating to finances, not being able to afford things like clothing afterwards, not being able to, fill the house with bedding, furniture, that kind of stuff. Also, like rising rents. And so because of just the general competitiveness of housing, it means landlords can be particularly selective of who they rent to. And this, of course, is going to disadvantage people who have recently left prison. A lot of people also described difficulty in either getting a reference because they've never rented in a house before, so just not having access to that at all, and so that made it difficult to go into rental properties. A few other comments kind of related to steps of freedom. So a lot of our participants felt that the steps of freedom money wasn't enough. It wasn't enough to do accommodation, food, clothing, transport, all the kind of stuff you need to set up after leaving prison, and that steps of freedom has stayed the same for maybe the last couple of decades or so. And also poor quality housing. So in a small number of cases, our participants reported living in outside structures. And so, we had those participants living in homes without electricity or water. We've had a couple of participants living in cars and buses. Another participant was living in a tent in their friend's backyard. And so, how sometimes on paper, it'll come up as, they've got housing or they're living in these situations, but the stories behind that can, often be much more different. I remember one participant saying too that it's a really poor equation when you get out of prison and your life was better in prison. And that's something that I think is quite a common sentiment as well. And I've heard a lot from other people who are kind of in these spaces, people describing prison as also the nicest accommodation they've ever lived in. So, also how do we kind of support people to see, life outside of prison as somewhere that they can actually be, like a better place for them to be. So some more comments, which Alice kind of covered, is so people often felt that that support came too little or too late. One participant described how they didn't get their address approved till 3 days before leaving, so it just made it a little more difficult, to kind of make more deliberate plans for that, what they were going to do post-release. In such instances, sometimes our participants would end up in like night shelters or, you know, just temporary accommodation for a few days before being able to access services or find other types of accommodation. Yeah, a small number of participants did own their own homes. We've kind of talked a little bit to that, and they also did describe a lot of kind of struggles and challenges in keeping their own homes, especially for shorter sentences, you know, of like 1 to 3 months, and not really having any kind of support around how they can either get tenants in or, you know, upkeep their like bill payments, that kind of stuff. But we have also heard some really positive stories as well of people who are in the situation and have gotten support with that. So that's been really awesome to see that kind of shift and how we can help people who do have their own homes kind of keep those. And so just kind of having that emphasis on prevention. Many respondents who did have somewhere to live did express concern about the temporary nature of that accommodation. Yeah, and they felt like they couldn't settle there either because, you know, they knew they had to leave. We did have one participant in their whānau who were in motel accommodation, but every single night, for some reason, they're saying they don't know why, every single night the motel owners made them change rooms. And so they're like, we didn't even bother unpacking our stuff. We felt like we could never settle, you know, so not even being able to, in those temporary places, necessarily create those kinds of feelings of home or safety or, you know, like that, just a space of their own. And that can make it really hard for people to settle and also reflects the instability of their situations. For those living with friends and family as well, they didn't sometimes feel like it was their own home, and we kind of covered that, you know, not wanting to feel like a burden, wanting their own place, also wanting to kind of, they did want to have feelings of independence and responsibility. And this was particularly the case for people who had children. Often such accommodation was stable, but not, you know, what they wanted or not ideal. And for many of these situations that I've described, the housing they had meant they wouldn't be classified as homeless, but the housing itself, you know, wasn't stable, wasn't secure, wasn't ideal or appropriate. So we really need to unpack this when we go further into the research, and hopefully something that will come out more as well in stage 2 interviews. So some of our study limitations, it's really hard, really hard trying to get in touch with our participants. So we had, you know, 203 we did in prison, and of that, you know, only got 80. We tried all these different methods. We were really lucky to get help from corrections, and they were able to give us their numbers, like kind of the most recent numbers that they had on file, so we could follow up with participants. That ended up being, I think, the most effective way of following up with participants. And now I'm doing the 1-year interviews as well, and I thought, okay, sweet, everyone I've talked to at the 6-month interviews, at least I'm definitely going to get them, and now I've just got to follow, you know, focus on the people I couldn't capture at the 6 months. That also wasn't true. That didn't happen at all. I went through like 40 people that I'd contacted at the 6 months, and, you know, we're about 6 months later. And at the time, you know, like, yes, definitely contact me on this number. I'm going to have it. It's a lot of straight to voicemails. My nightmares is just voicemail beeps. Some participants as well, you know, are reluctant to pick up numbers from unknown numbers, that kind of thing. Always try to send a text beforehand, just so they kind of know who we are. It's very hard as well to use other forms of contact, such as emails, and I think that's reflective as well of the digital exclusion that a lot of our participants experience. There are some concerns as well that we aren't reaching those who might be in highly unstable situations, you know, just by the very nature of being able to contact the people who we do contact. But yeah, we're hoping that we can at least capture the other extreme of that by the people who have gone back into prison. And we will be exploring this further in our kind of 1 year and stage 2 interviews. There was some problems with COVID-19. I again thought, like, yes, no one's going to have anything else to do but answer my calls. Like, I'm going to get everybody. That didn't happen either. There was, and Hawke's Bay was where we got the most number of people. And that's where we were meant to be doing the interviews, was during the lockdown. So we did lose quite a few contacts there. Of the people I have talked to in the 1 year follow-ups, you know, we kind of like check in about COVID and lockdown, you know, how was it, kind of expecting like, oh, maybe it was really horrible and all these bad things. And to be honest, the most common response I've gotten is like, are you kidding? I'm like the most prepared person for lockdown. It was the easiest thing. Like, I don't know why everybody was complaining. So that seems to be a good running joke that they're all, it's something that was unexpected, but you know, shouldn't have been, I suppose. Yeah, perfect. Also, there was difficulties too in just kind of, just even organizing the interviews, where they would be. You know, it is difficult to meet, you know, in kind of like different places. There were lots of times where, only a couple of times where I'd organize an interview, you know, and then they wouldn't show up. So I lived it. I've been stood up in a cafe, but that's okay. And just people as well who did show a really strong interest in the research, but, you know, I'd be following them up like 4 times every week kind of thing. And obviously we're just not a priority. So we did lose a few people with that kind of thing as well. It was really helpful having a koha for our participants. So we had $40 per interview at the 6-month and 1-year stage, either grocery vouchers, petrol vouchers, or cell phone top-ups. And having the cell phone top-ups as well in itself was just really, I think, beneficial in the sense that if it was the petrol or grocery vouchers, you know, they did have to wait for it to be sent in the post, and that in itself can be, you know, like sometimes they just didn't have that time really. And so like having a koha option that you could give instantly was appreciated by a lot of participants. I suppose another kind of study limitation in the terms of this aspect of the study is still really kind of being acutely aware and acknowledging that things like colonization, intergenerational trauma, institutional racism are firmly embedded in all our kind of major kind of social institutions, and how these things can have impacts on our Māori participants, and how they, you know, it informs their experiences with the criminal justice system. Those things inform their experiences with housing. And so we're hoping to unpack that more in the stage 2 interviews. So in conclusion, the 6-month data we have so far has revealed, you know, what you would kind of expect. Housing can be incredibly temporary, incredibly unstable. It can be difficult. Much of the focus of support services is on finding housing on release from prison, but because of the housing instability associated, you know, with our participants, we wonder if we should also be considering how can we also extend that housing to be more long-term and stable, or how can we make sure that housing is actually perceived as a home by our participants, you know, that sense of ontological security, somewhere where they belong. A lot of times we kind of talk to participants and, you know, they kind of describe all these really challenging things that are going on in their lives. And you'd be like, oh, so, you know, what's the most challenging? What are you finding really difficult? And for the most part, I was quite surprised that almost, you know, a huge majority of participants would just talk about things about like connection, just wanting to connect with people, wanting to feel like they belong, you know, having really big social anxiety, going out into large groups of people. And so I remember one participant said to her, they were like, getting out is easy, getting out of prison is easy. It's society seeing you as different is the hard part. And so how can we kind of foster that sense of home and belonging and inclusion in public and private spheres? Even that as well wasn't always necessarily so kind of difficult or challenging. Sometimes you like ask those questions, and one participant was like, oh, the most difficult thing right now is just making my kids do their chores. And someone else was like, oh, it's living with my daughter-in-law. And someone else was like, oh, it's just trying to stick to being vegetarian. So although, you know, leaving prison can be this quite complex, complicated, disheartening experience, it's not an absolute. You know, we can have lots of like, there are participants with lots of really kind of positive experiences as well. So yeah, I'm now in the process of doing the 1-year interviews. It's been harder and harder to find participants the kind of longer the study's gone on, but we're hoping we'll get roughly the same numbers as our 6 months. Stage 2 of the research will include longer narrative interviews, so more like in-depth kind of like life narrative interviews, asking about housing and home and just their lives in general. And that's being mainly done by a PhD student, Grace, and the focus of her PhD is more on the experiences of women leaving prison and housing. And yeah, so that's kind of our research so far, we're kind of approaching the final part of the quantitative section of the study. And so, you know, we've had a lot of really valuable learnings from our participants. And so, yeah, we just think it's really important that when it comes to policy and that kind of stuff, that we are foregrounding the experiences of people who have left prison. And we'll update you next year on how that all goes.
Thank you. Looking forward to the next iteration. Just a couple of questions. You noted the differences between the sample versus the prison releasee population. Are you doing any weighting in terms of your representativeness?
I'm going to turn that over to Barry because it's a stats question.
In terms of representing the overall population, prison population, we haven't considered that. The major issue was making sure that the ones who had stable housing were exchangeable in this circumstance. Those who didn't, in other words, those who get stable housing are likely to differ number of the household. In the sample design, sample design chose a range of prisons, partly out of convenience to use that word, because of the ones that you were able to get into. You did decide to choose a range.
Yeah, so with the prisons, it's actually, what we did was we actually looked at the prisons that have the highest number of releases. So some prisons obviously don't release people very often at all. So it's about kind of maximising our resources and our time there. But yes, it was also to try and get a more representative sample. At one point we weren't sure whether we were going to go to Christchurch, for example, and we were advised. We have a research advisory group, and they actually really encouraged us to go to Christchurch because it was felt that dynamics in Christchurch would be quite different. Indeed, that's what we found.
You could.
Yeah, no, I was just thinking in terms of the women, it's great that you've got a larger sample of women. I know it's difficult to get the proportion, but then if they are different, as we suspect, then does that then skew the total overall results? Yeah, that's just. And the other question I was wondering, in terms of your getting hold of people, you connected up with corrections.
Yes.
Have you thought of or tried connecting up with the NGOs, if you knew which NGOs they were?
Yeah, we have actually tried that. We tried that particularly with the women because there was only one, at the time, the Advocate Service Schoolroom was run by one agency. So we thought actually that's the ideal people to start with. And we asked them if they had anybody from our list on their books, and they didn't have anybody.
Oh, we got one.
So it didn't prove as fruitful as we were hoping.
We have a couple of questions in the Zoom chat. The first one's from Liza, saying that she found the question about expected post-prison housing really interesting, especially the range of situations captured. Do you have any sense of how New Zealand might compare to other countries on this? And any other trends that you noticed around this variable?
In terms of other countries, not particularly. I don't think there's anything. I mean, I'm just thinking about my own research from the UK that's sort of dabbled in this, and I'd say there's potentially more living in NGO housing in the UK, and probably fewer living with family and friends. That's the main thing. But otherwise, not particularly.
And the halfway housing?
Oh yeah, the other thing to bear in mind is that a lot of other jurisdictions have fairly well established halfway housing systems. So particularly in Canada and the US and in the UK, places like bail hostels and probation hostels are often also used for people coming out of prison as well. And New Zealand doesn't really have that kind of substantial network of halfway houses. It's much more of a kind of patchwork effect, really.
Hopefully they heard that. Might be worth just moving on. But the second question was, okay, Liza said a little harder to hear, but doable. Okay. And the second question was, Libby Mitchell wondering if you are planning on running a causal or regression analysis to quantify what the percentage change in recidivism rate is if the offender is released into stable housing.
Over to you, Barry.
The answer to that question is yes, we're running a regression analysis, trying to get as close to what we can. We haven't thought about how to report that, which is the second part of the question, but what would be the percent change in recidivism if everyone was put that around? We certainly presented that way. I think that's more a presentation issue than the analysis you do. But everyone else, if you will probably know, we'll get that out of that. So yes. Yeah. Oh yeah, of course.
Yeah, run up.
Apologies, I was a long way from the computer. The answer to that question is yes, we plan to do a regression type analysis that gets us as close to a causal estimate as possible for the reasons I stated before, but you wouldn't have heard, that there's obviously going to be big differences, well, there's potentially at least big differences between those who are in stable housing and those who are not. So we need to somehow account for those factors in order to make a claim, something like, if you moved this number of people into stable housing, this would be your reduction in recidivism.
Not yet is the answer to that, yeah, but that will be one of our further analysis, because we're quite aware that our sample has got quite a lot of short terms in it, and that actually is one thing that we do really need to bear in mind because of the differentials in terms of support offered to short terms and long terms. So that is kind of can be quite crucial in later analysis. Yeah,
maybe that's some
kind of aware that there's a kind of hardcore of short terms that go in and out and are often in and out several times within the space of a year, for example, and they are most transient, but by the same token they're frequently people for whom there are no services, so we're really kind of keen to they're the hardest to get hold of, but they're probably the most important to get hold of in some ways because they're frequently not, their voices aren't heard in other ways. So.
Yeah, and our measure of that too is self-reported data from the first interview, unless someone would help.
I was really interested because obviously there's a really high proportion of prisoners who are parents, and you said at the beginning something about some people worrying about getting appropriate housing for that. And I wondered really, I guess, the difference between what their aspirations might have been around living situations for their children, what their expectations were, and also then what happened, and if there were reflections that people made about whether they were able to or weren't able to live with their children.
Yeah, I mean, it came up quite often in terms of their expectations and where they thought they would be living post-release, and in particular, there was a substantial kind of amount of disappointment where they knew that it was going to be hard for the children to visit. And in some cases, it was about that lack of space in terms of motel rooms, for example, but also it was about they maybe living with somebody else who they don't want their children to be around for whatever reason. So that was the main kind of thing that came forward. Yeah. And we can come later on when we do some more complex analysis, we can break that down in terms of who has children, because that was something that we collected as well, and whether or not they were actually living with their children before they went into prison, and how many of their children were living, of course, as well.
Thanks for that. It's really challenging study. And the question is, correct me if I'm wrong. You mentioned that one of the limitations is that the interview will likely retain those who are stable. So how do you prepare for that?
Yeah,
this is a good question. Is about stable housing.
Yeah.
Is associated.
Yeah, this is
recidivism. And having said that, what are the challenges that you encountered in terms of marrying the two findings, like the finding and you have stories that are more complex than what you have in the numbers?
Yes. that's the challenge of mixed methods research, I think, just in general. I have to marry the two, and particularly when you have qualitative data appearing out of something that was supposed to be quantitative. But, you know, when Cinnamon and myself are both predominantly qualitative researchers anyway, so it wasn't exactly a surprise to us that people want to talk about things that are not necessarily on the interview schedule, or want to elaborate in particular on things that are on the interview schedule. So I think, I mean, and what that often helps us with, what that qualitative data helps us with, is actually just explaining some of those figures, crucially. And in particular, for us at the moment, and this is kind of partly because of the limited data that we've analysed at this stage, it has really brought home that transient nature of the so many post-release journeys, and even just those, and how they often expect that transience even before they've left prison, even if they've got somewhere to go. And that has really, that qualitative data has really illuminated that in a way that just counting how many times they've moved doesn't really do that. So I think that's been actually really, really beneficial. In terms of your other question, again, I might defer to Barry, because we are aware of this. We're kind of waiting to see how it pans out with 12 months interviews as well. We are aware.
Yeah, that's a difficult one, and that's one that could make the analysis very difficult. One thing I was very impressed by and surprised by is how close people's expectations were to their reality in terms of the type of housing they were living in. So at the very least, we could see whether the 200 who we started with, what their intentions were, whether they actually had more stable intentions, if that makes sense, than the 80 that you eventually saw at the 6 month. If that's the case, we're on slightly more stable ground to say, okay, it probably doesn't matter. In other words, it's not that, you're just getting the more stable people. If that's not the case, then we have to think hard, basically. And I don't have an answer to that yet, I don't think. But it is an issue.
All suggestions gratefully received.
We did aspire to have housing after going out of prison, because from what I understand, there is a subgroup of homeless people that you find, that you feel at home in the streets instead of being in a house physically. And so I wonder, for that group, would post housing stability be a significant contributor for reducing rates of recidivism?
You didn't have that many though, did you?
We didn't have that many. I mean, we had a lot of people that didn't necessarily know where they were going to live. And one of the things is, of course, is that some of the people that were street homeless in particular, and we have to be really careful about these definitions of homelessness, because what you're talking about really is street homelessness, so which is quite a narrow definition. But a lot of those were the people that we spoke to in prisons, and they'd sometimes had some accommodation, but it was often quite fleeting. And it's often in relation to kind of tensions, conflicts, or alternatively being somewhere that they didn't feel safe, and they didn't want to stay because they felt safe on the streets. I must admit, I did wonder about this myself, and I'm kind of keeping a bit of an eye on what's happened in relation to COVID, particularly in Auckland, where they've basically, the City Mission and some other agencies found as many people as they could living on the streets and put them in motels, because that was always the notion, that there are some people who want to be homeless that have street whānau, that want to stay with their street whānau as well, and, you know, in some respects are happier on the street. So I'm kind of watching to see what happens in relation to that group of people, because I actually think that's going to tell us more about the street homelessness than our sample is going to be honest.
Yeah, unfortunately with that kind of subgroup as well, we did have quite a few people kind of mention that in our first interviews, but we only got to follow up with one of them at the 6 months interview as well. So it's been difficult to it'll be difficult. We wish we could have more of those people who kind of conceptualize homelessness or, you know, home in that way, so we could kind of unpack it more in the qualitative interviews. So just trying to get interviews with those people who do kind of see home that kind of way. Yeah. She's on the project.
Any questions?
It's kind of like out of curiosity, was there anyone that expressed that they actually enjoyed being in prison, or like they felt home, you know? So I would imagine if someone felt like that, they wouldn't really bother looking for an alternate position for
Yeah, we have talked to people who, quite a few people, you know, who said that like life was better in prison, or they did feel more at home at prison. But what we kind of heard from them as well when talking the 6-month interviews is it's quite the opposite to that. So, you know, a lot of them were like, I really am trying so hard not to go back to prison. Like, I know it's comfortable there. I know I can have a sense of safety there, but just because, you know, they acknowledge that reality, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's a reality that they want, you know, to be part of their kind of life. So we kind of had a lot of people being like, I'm trying so hard, I'm doing everything to build like a home in the spaces I have, so I don't have to see prison as the better kind of, you know, like home to be in. So yeah, that in itself too is that kind of, I suppose that kind of tension between like my life is better in prison, but I'm going to do everything I can for it not to be that way anymore. So yeah, they kind of try, I think, if anything, they'd try more not to go back because they, you know, they just didn't want that kind of thing anymore.
And that often goes hand in hand, of course, with addiction issues as well.
All right. Thank you very, very much. Thank you for the excellent discussion too. Thank you.